Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Just a couple of announcements. Well, first of all, thank you again for everyone taking time to come out to the FSRDC presentation series. Just so everyone knows, this session will be recorded. We have a couple of people who wanted to hear Dominic's presentation, but were unable to make it. And also, along with that, the chat and the Q&A panel over to the side of your screen will not be included in the recorded presentation. So today we have the great pleasure of listening to Dominic. Dominic Smith is a research economist at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and he will be giving his presentation titled The Evolution of U.S. Retail Concentration. So before we turn it over to him, just a reminder that if anyone is interested in presenting their work, to please reach out. We are more than interested to have anyone who's willing and cares to present their work do so. So without further ado, Dominic, the time is yours.
Okay, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to talk about this. If you have any questions while I'm talking, just toss them in the Q&A. I can see it, and so I'll try to answer as many questions live as I can. And a quick disclaimer that any opinions or conclusions expressed here aren't the conclusions of the Census Bureau. All the results I'm going to show you have been reviewed. And I'm going to talk about some public companies during this talk. And anytime I do that, that's based on public information and doesn't imply that they're in my sample. And this is joint work with Sergio Ocampo, who's at Western University. So the motivation for this project is that there have been big changes in the aggregate structure of the retail sector. There have been a number of papers documenting big increases in national concentration in retail, driven by the growth of national retailers such as Walmart, Target, Home Depot, Lowe's, and many other retailers that I'm sure you shop at all the time. At the same time that these national retailers are growing, there's been a lot of exit of smaller firms, the mom and pops and the regional retail chains. And so we want to think about what are the changes, what are the effects of these changes on consumers? And you might think, well, you hear increasing concentration, that probably implies that there are increases in markups and market power. But it also, this expansion of retailers may be because these national chains just have lower costs than the mom and pops that they're replacing. But if you want to think about the negative side of concentration, the markups and the market power, you have to take into account the fact that retail markets are local. When consumers are deciding where to buy their gallon of milk, they're not choosing between all the grocery stores in the United States. They're choosing between the ones that they can get to without driving too far. And even now, when you're thinking about maybe something like buying a shirt, you're going to choose between the retailers that are located nearby, or maybe an online retailer like Amazon. Now, that's not going to be a problem for this study because I'm only going to go to 2012, but we'll talk at the end about how I think online retailers play a role in this story. But if there are any negative effects of concentration, they're going to operate through these local markets. And so the first thing I'm going to think about is, what does the increase in national concentration imply for local markets? And I'm going to show that I can decompose the National Herfindahl Index into two components, a local Herfindahl Index and a cross-market Herfindahl Index. And so when I think about what does this increase in national concentration imply for local markets, I can write national in terms of local, and I find out that national and local concentration measure completely different concepts. So even though national concentration depends on local concentration, 98% of the value and the change in national concentration is driven by changes in cross-market concentration. And cross-market concentration measures the extent to which consumers in different markets are shopping at the same retailers. So these big increases in national concentration reflect the fact that no matter where you live, you're going to be shopping at the same set of national retailers. whereas local concentration captures whether consumers in the same market are shopping at the same retailer. And that doesn't have to move in the same direction as national concentration does. So then I'm going to use census data to measure local retail concentration. And I can measure concentration directly for product markets. And so that means I can measure concentration in something like furniture, groceries, clothing, and electronics, which is the relevant measure for competition in retail, and I'm going to contrast with industry concentration, which is the type of concentration that you typically see. And the problem in retail is that there's one industry, general merchandisers, who compete with everyone else. So general merchandisers are companies like Walmart and Target, and they're going to compete with the grocery store and the clothing store at the same time. When I measure local concentration, I find that it increases steadily over 30 years, and that these increases are widespread across products and markets. And so the final thing that I do is I found that local concentration is increased. I want to think about, what does this mean for consumers? And the way that I do this is I take an off-the-shelf model that links prices, markups, and costs from Atkinson and Bernstein. And the key mechanism in this model is that higher local concentration implies increasing markups and potentially lower pass-through of the cost savings that are leading to the expansion of national retailers. What I find there is that markups increased by 2 percentage points between 1992 and 2012 due to the increase in local concentration. This is about 1/3 of the observed increase in markups, implying that local concentration had some effect on markups, but that there's still room for alternative explanations, such as falling elasticity of demand of consumers. And during the same time period, retail prices fell by 35%. And so to the extent that these falling retail prices are reflecting lower costs, it actually appears that most of these lower costs have been passed on to consumers, and that local concentration hasn't played a large role in dampening the pass-through of these costs. The papers related to a bunch of previous work. The first that I've already kind of talked about is work showing that there's been increasing national concentration and markups in the US economy as a whole and in the retail sector in particular. I've highlighted these two papers in that section because that's where I'm going to pull the model that I use to map changes in local concentration into changes in markups. The second literature that we're talking about is literature on local concentration. And here, the big advantage that we have is we're using census data on retail sales, which is something that no one else has. And so we're able to tell you what's been happening to retail output over a 30-year period. And we're going to find that retail concentration has been steadily increasing over these periods. That's different than what the Rossi, Hansberg, Sarte, and Tractor find using data from Dun & Bradstreet, the NETS data. But it's similar to what both Kevin Rintz and Ben Lipsius have found using other census data looking at labor markets. So they're finding evidence for decreasing local concentration overall, but specifically increasing local concentration in retail on the employment side. So it looks like retail has both increasing employment concentration and increasing product concentration when we look in the census data, which is kind of the gold standard to think about these questions. And then finally, we're talking about the importance of big firms. And I think in particular, one of the things that you should think about here is that we're providing additional evidence that there's been a lot of expansion of national retailers, and that's what's driving the growth in national concentration. So let me quickly tell you what are retailers. And so the short answer is that retailers are establishments in NAICS sectors 44 and 45. The definition to be in the retail sector is that you need to sell final goods to consumers, and you need to not transform any material. And so those two definitions are going to eliminate a number of establishments that might colloquially be considered part of retail. So restaurants aren't going to be considered in retail under the NAICS definition because they transform raw food into cooked food. Wholesalers differ from retailers in that they sell to businesses. And then there are a number of services establishments, such as barbers, gyms, things like that, where they don't sell a physical good. And so they're also not what I'm talking about when I say retail. I'm going to exclude two additional areas of retail from the main results that I'm going to show you. The first is auto dealers and gas stations, because there's a large degree of franchising in those industries. And so it's hard to think about what concentration means. When I was living in Minneapolis and I was going to buy a car, I could buy from Luther Brookdale Honda, Luther Bloomington Honda, or Luther Edina Toyota. So theoretically, those three companies were all owned by this Luther guy who owned a bunch of car dealerships, but the salesmen at those companies competed pretty hard against each other to try to beat the quotes. And so I don't know how that ownership is handled in the census data. And I also don't know exactly how conceptually you should handle those types of issues. And so we're going to sidestep that. The second is non-store retailers. So this is something like Amazon e-commerce stores, also any sort of mail order catalogs. And the issue there is that I know the sales of these firms at a national level, but I don't know where they're sending their sales. I can make a bunch of assumptions about where those sales are going. So I can say, this e-commerce giant has 3% of national sales. Let's just say that those sales go to each market proportionally to that they basically make up 3% of the sales in each market. And I can show you that non-store retailers are not big enough in order to matter. But it's just a fundamental data issue that when I'm talking about local markets, I don't actually know where their sales are going. And then Sam, I see your question about would a grocery store with a butcher shop be included? And yes, it would. So within a retail establishment, these establishments are classified based on what the majority of their sales come from. And so if you have a grocery store that mostly sells goods, but they also rent out a carpet cleaner machine and they have a butcher shop as well, those will actually be reported as separate line items in their sales, and I'm able to remove those sales for kind of retail adjacent activities. So let me tell you about the data that I'm using here. My primary source of data comes from the Census of Retail Trade, which is part of the economic census. I have data from 1982 to 2012, every 5 years in years ending in 2 and 7. The key variables that I observe are the location of each of these retail stores. I know what zip code the retail stores are in. I know what county they're in. I've mapped those counties to 722 commuting zones, which partition the United States. And that's my primary measure of what a product market is, the 722 commuting zones. In addition to those, I've also considered other definitions such as MSAs. There are about 900 MSAs, and they don't partition the US. And so this is kind of the first place that I'll talk a little bit about experience using census data, which is with, because every store isn't in an MSA, now whenever you want to do results at the commuting zone level and the MSA level, you have two different samples, and that creates a bunch of hassles in disclosures when you've got semi-overlapping samples. And so generally we try to stick to the zip code, county, and commuting zone because those are all the same set of firms. And so getting through the review process is just easier, although we have done everything with the MSAs as well, and you find the same story there. The second key variable we observe is the industry of each of these stores. I know their NAICS code, and so that's a 6-digit code that tells you what type of stuff these stores primarily sell, such as whether they're a grocery store, a men's clothing store, a women's clothing store, a toy store. But in addition to the industry of these establishments, I also have the reported sales, which I aggregate to be sales by 20 product categories. And the level of detail I have here are categories like clothing and groceries. And so let me tell you why that sales data is important, and then I'm going to give you a little bit more detail on what exactly that sales data looks like, because it was compiling it was a big project, but I think also a big benefit of this project. So typically when people have worked with census data and generally business data in the past, they define markets based on the industry of each establishment in their data set. And so you could see things like, you might see some establishments of Whole Foods and Trader Joe's, and those would be stores in NAICS code 445 grocery stores. You'd see other establishments in NAICS 452, general merchandisers, that'd be your Walmart and Target, and then stores in NAICS 448, clothing stores, and that'd be something like TJ Maxx and Old Navy. And you'd recognize that Whole Foods and Trader Joe's compete with each other, Walmart and Target compete with each other, and TJ Maxx and Old Navy compete with each other. But Walmart sells clothing and groceries. And the nice thing that I'm able to do with the census data that you really can't do with other sources of data is I can divide these general merchandisers into pieces. And so I can split off the part of Walmart and Target that sells groceries, and I can have them compete with Whole Foods and Trader Joe's, and I can split off the part of Walmart and Target that sell clothing, and I can have them compete with TJ Maxx and Old Navy. And so for the purposes of this paper, I'm going to treat Walmart groceries and Walmart clothing as separate companies that compete with the relevant clothing and grocery retailers in their vicinity. These data come from census of retail trade forms, which look like the form on the left-hand side. And you can see from this form that these companies are actually asked to provide sales for fairly detailed product areas. So women's clothes, men's clothes, children's clothes, and then footwear. And so, but the issue there is that if you just try to use these data in the raw form, you're going to run into a few problems. So I observed store sales, overall store sales for my entire sample, every single store in the US. But I only observed sales by product line, these sales that are captured on this form, for stores accounting for about 80% of sales. And this is because the single unit stores are only sampled. So rather than asking every single unit store to provide this detailed data, for many of them, they just get their total sales from administrative records from the IRS, and they don't ask for any more detail here. And so for stores accounting for about 20% of sales, I need to figure out what they sell. And what I observe for these stores is I observe their overall sales, and I know what industry they're in. And so what I do is I aggregate these individual product lines into product categories such as clothing, where I can be very sure that I've aggregated enough that I know that single unit stores in a given industry only sell one of those product categories, or at most, two. And then I'm going to impute sales for those stores with missing data. And so this was the big benefit of this project in terms of satisfying the requirements to have a proposed project in the RDCs. You have to provide benefits, and cleaning these data is the big thing that we did for this project. And so the key observation is basically, if I know that a mom and pop store is in the men's clothing industry, they might sell some children's clothing, but they're not going to sell groceries. And so I'm able to impute that basically 100% of their sales are in clothing. Okay, and so that finishes talking about the data. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to tell you how I measure concentration and what's happened to both national and local concentration. And then once I do that, I'm going to talk about how we use a model to map changes in local concentration into changes in markups. And so our primary measure of concentration is the Herfindahl-Hirschman index. The Herfindahl-Hirschman index for some product J is the sum of sales shares of individual firms in that product area squared. And so if you look at this equation hard enough and you think, what does this Herfindahl index mean? Well, you can interpret it as the probability that two random dollars are spent at the same firm in some product area. So if you think about, I'm just selecting $2 spent on retail at random in some product area. What's the probability that I choose firm I? Well, that's that firm's share of national sales in that product category, SIJ. And now I choose a second dollar. If I'm choosing those $2 independently, the probability that I choose that firm again is also SIJ. And so if you sum the square of all those probabilities, you get the probability that two random dollars are spent in the same firm. And it's that insight that's going to let us decompose the national Herfindahl index into a local, to write the national Herfindahl index in terms of local. Before I go through the math there, let me tell you what's happened to the national Herfindahl index at the product level. It's increased pretty sharply. Starting in 1992, you have a national Herfindahl index of about 1.5% down at the bottom left. By 2012, that number had increased to being over 4%. And if you think about this as a probability, that means if you choose $2 at random spent in the retail sector, in 1992, the probability that those $2 are spent at the same firm was less than 1 in 50. And now it's greater than 1 in 25. So those are pretty big changes in those probabilities over just 20 years. And these product level results are in line with what previous people have found with industry results. But now you're looking at this graph, and what I want you to think about is, what does this tell me about what's happening in local markets? And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you a quick example to help you understand that it doesn't tell you anything about what's happening in local markets. And then I'm going to show you the math behind that intuition. So let's just think of a very simple example where we have a world with two different markets, and each of those markets has two firms that just split the market evenly. In this world, the national HHI is 0.25, and the average local HHI is 0.5. And now let's go ahead and increase national concentration and see what happens to local. Well, there are three different ways that national concentration can increase. First, I can just rename the firms in the market. So now I have, rather than firm A and firm C, I just have Walmart in both markets. If that happens, then national concentration is increased, local concentration is unchanged. But what if when Walmart entered these two markets, they were able to outcompete firms B and firms D? Well, then both national and local concentration increase. The third option is that when Walmart enters, the other retailer closes but is replaced by a bunch of smaller niche retailers who each capture a small part of the market. In that case, national concentration increases, but local concentration falls. So really, when national concentration is changing, local concentration can move in any direction. So now let me tell you what's going on with the math behind that. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to decompose the National Herfindahl Index into the local HHI and a term which I'm calling cross-market concentration. And so now let's continue thinking about what's the probability that two random dollars, X and Y, which are spent at retail firms IX and IY, are spent at the same firm. Well, I can use the law of total probability to decompose that into the probability that those $2 are spent at the same firm, conditional on them being spent in the same market. MX equals MY. That's the local Herfindahl Index. And then the other term is what's the probability that they're spent at the same firm, conditional on them being spent in different markets, and that's the cross-market term. These two terms are weighted by the probability that if I choose $2 at random, those dollars are spent in the same market, which I call collocation. And if you think about the US has many markets that are far apart, very different. And so this collocation term is really small. It's 2% on average over this time period, and it's very stable. And so what that means is that the National Herfindahl Index is a weighted average of the local Herfindahl Index and the cross-market index, but the weight on the local HHI is only 2%. And so even if you went from a world where the local HHI was 0 to where the local HHI was 1, you wouldn't get a big enough increase in the national concentration to explain the size of increase that we've actually seen, the 3.5 percentage point increase in national concentration over these 20 years. And so if you want to know what's happening in local product markets, you need to actually have microdata on the sales in those local markets. And that's what we do. And we find that whether you measure local product markets with commuting zones, counties, or zip codes, local concentration has been steadily increasing, maybe flattening out in the final 5 years that we have data for, 2007 to 2012. These changes are about 2 percentage points over the entire time period, which is less than the 3.5 percentage point increase in national HHI. And they're all starting from a much higher level than the national HHI. So in terms of percent increases, they're also quite small. These changes are pretty robust. We think about what is the role of e-commerce. I've kind of mentioned this already. And we find that at least through 2012, when e-commerce is about 3% of US retail sales, it's just not big enough to have an effect through 2012, at least in the aggregate. These changes are very widespread. So almost every product category, it's only clothing that doesn't have increasing local concentration. And about 2/3 of local markets have increasing concentration. I'll just show you real quick, just increases at the product level. So these are the our eight big product areas that we typically show. And you can see I'm plotting 1992, 2002, and 2012, the average local HHI for each of these product categories. And you can see that the local concentration is increasing in every category except for clothing, where you have a decrease between 2002 and 2012. But sporting goods, home goods, toys, health goods, electronics and appliances, and groceries are all seeing increases in local concentration during this time period. And so now that I've hopefully convinced you that local concentration has been increasing in retail, I want to think about what these changes mean for consumers. First thing I just want to think about is, are these numbers big? So I told you that there's been a 2 percentage point increase in the local Herfindahl index, but I don't know what the Herfindahl index means for something like welfare or prices. And so I'm going to try to turn that 2 percentage point increase in local HHI into a number that you can interpret more readily. And talk about what does this mean in terms of market power and markups and consumer welfare. Although the key problem that I'm going to have throughout this whole exercise is that there are basically 3 things that we could care about: prices, markups, and costs. And I'm only going to have information on markups. And so if costs are falling and markups are increasing, prices can be falling even in the face of rising markups. The way I'm going to do this is I'm going to use an off-the-shelf model of firm markups based on Atkinson and Bernstein's model of oligopolistic competition. And so let me give you a quick summary of what's happening here. In this model, a market is a product and location pair. There are capital J products and capital L locations. There are I firms that compete in quantities or Carnot competition in a market. And product demand is CES with an elasticity epsilon J. Firms differ in their market-specific marginal costs. And the key thing about this model is that it's going to give me a simple equation that links Herfindahl-Hirschman indexes and aggregate markups. And the way it does this comes from the pricing, the optimal pricing conditions for each firm. So the price of that firm I charges for product J in location L depends on the markup that they charge, mu I JL, and the cost of that retailer, lambda I JL. The optimal condition for this markup is that it depends on the elasticity of substitution that these firms face, epsilon J, with firms charging higher markups on goods with a lower elasticity of substitution. And it also depends on that firm's market share in a given product in a location. The higher share that a firm has, the higher markup they're going to change. So as Sij approaches 1, the markup that a firm charges approaches infinity. And so this implies that if a firm has a higher share, they're going to have lower prices. That's the way that firms get those higher shares. And it means that they also, and the way that they have these lower prices is through higher productivity. So higher share implies lower prices, higher productivity, higher markups in this model. But the key in this model is that these mu I JLs, you can aggregate them across I's and across locations to get an expression for the aggregate markup, mu J. And that depends, once again, on the elasticities of substitution and the average local Herfindahl index in that product. And so now what I can do is, if I have estimates for these epsilons, I can plug in a change in Herfindahl indexes, and I can know how much I would expect markups to change. In order to do this, I'm going to add in data from another census source, the Annual Retail Trade Survey, which has the gross margin, which is revenue cost of goods sold, for a bunch of retail industries. It's an annual survey conducted between 1993 and 2012. And what I'm going to do to get the epsilon J's is I'm going to estimate them to match the 1993 markups from ARTS, given what I found for local Herfindahls in 1992. And then I'm going to change local Herfindahls to equal their level in 2012 and find that if the epsilon J's, if the elasticities of substitution stayed the same between 1993 and 2012, the increase in Herfindahl would imply a 2 percentage point increase in markups, which is about 1/3 of the observed increase in the annual retail trade survey. And so, if you want to the extent that you believe this model of demand, what you'd conclude is that consumers must have become less elastic for some reason over these 20 years. And there's actually been recent work by people like James Brand and Gideon Bernstein, which has found evidence that consumers have become less elastic, either because retailers are offering a wider range of niche products that consumers are less willing to substitute between, or because as consumers get older, they become less willing to change in their ways. And so as the US population has aged, the aggregate elasticity of demand has decreased. So let me show you what these changes in markups look like across different product categories, just because there is some interesting heterogeneity here. So if we look at the retail sector, we're going to see in the circles that are filled in, you see what I would find in the model just by changing the local Herfindahl index. And the hollow diamonds are what I find in the data, in ARTS, how much markups have changed. And so you can see just, this first row is the numbers that I've been talking about. Roughly a 2 percentage point increase in markups in the model and a 6 percentage point increase in the data. But in some places like furniture and clothing, you see big increases in markups in the data, much smaller markups changes in the model. I think part of this is coming from the fact that in the data, I didn't highlight this when I was telling you the data, although I did say the words, I think, which is that I'm seeing markups by retail industry. And in particular in clothing, general merchandisers are getting an increasing share of clothing sales over this time period. And so these are markups of establishments in the clothing industry. And those can be very different from markups of retailers that sell clothing. For example, if Walmart has lower markups on clothing and they're out competing the large clothing retailers, then clothing markups could be falling while clothing industry markups are rising. So that's one of the issues that we have here, trying to hit the data exactly. And with that, let me go ahead and conclude. So this project, we did some direct measurement of local concentration at the product level. Big benefit there was that we were able to account for the fact that retail firms compete in products across industries. We found that both local and national concentration are rising in the retail sector, although they rise for different reasons, and that national trends aren't informative about local concentration. The higher local concentration increased markups about 2 percentage points. And that explains about 1/3 of the rise in markups. And so that concludes what I wanted to say about my paper. I have another slide on just experience using the RDC that I was asked to present. I don't know if anybody has any questions that they wanted to ask before I go to that, or if I should just go to that right away.
Dominic, why don't you go ahead and tell us about your experience, and then we can go to the Q&A.
Okay. So I have 3 pieces of advice. And so one is, the thing that I found most helpful is make tables ahead of time outside the RDC, and then bring those into the RDC. And when you're going through the disclosure process, put notes in the tables that you're disclosing and automate as much of that as possible. And I'm going to share my Excel in a second to show you what I mean there. But the basic problem is once you get your, sometimes there can be a delay between when you submit your disclosure and when you get it back. And it can be hard to remember, like, what sample exactly did I use when I created this table? What do each of these numbers mean? And you can often find that, like, that information should be fairly easy to find if you can go back in the RDC. But I mean, right now I'm writing this, having not been in an RDC in a year due to the pandemic, and I'm very happy that I had very good notes in each of the table talking about exactly where each of these numbers are coming from. Final thing, the final two things are just everything's going to take longer than you think it will. And now that you've read that, if you're updating and saying, oh, it's okay, fine, it's going to take longer than I thought it would, it's probably going to take longer than that as well. So just be ready for delays everywhere. And then finally, talk to anyone who's used your data, because there are a number of kind of undocumented issues with different data sources. And it can be hard to figure out what you don't know until you talk to people. I remember when I was starting as an RA at the board, and the first time I was working with census data, I was just doing some stuff. I was doing some regressions that looked at changes in employment between the 1990s and 2000s. And one of the controls I had in there was the industry of the establishment. And I was talking to somebody and they're like, well, what are you doing about the fact about the SIC to NAICS transition? I was like, I hadn't heard anything about about this transition. And I mean, as soon as they said it, I realized, oh, half of the establishments in my sample don't actually have industry codes, and so they're dropping out. But it was, these are just things where talking to people can be really helpful. Let's see. So I see a question, when I say talk to people who have used my data, who do I recommend for these data? Yeah, so if you want to use the sensitive retail trade, I'm probably a good person to start with, because I've been using them for 6 years now. And if you send me an email and you have a question that I can't answer, I can filter you towards the people who I ask when I'm confused. Let's see, if consumer surplus depends on prices rather than markups, can you disaggregate CPI or other data to the local product level? That is a good question. And it is something that I've been working on as someone who works at the BLS in the prices group. I am trying to do exactly that, although there are both data issues and confidentiality issues that we've been working on solving before I can give you that answer. But that is kind of the big direction that we're going with this project, is trying to be able to say something along those lines. And so to go back to just tell you, because I think it's always helpful to see exactly what someone is talking about when they, so you guys can't see my screen yet because I just covered it up, but I am going to share the monitor. And so, okay. And so this is what I do now when I go through a disclosure. Is before I went and created any programs inside the RDC, my co-author and I went through and we made a document, which I have on the left-hand side here, which has the exact table that you would find in our paper, and also a long note about all the little nitty-gritty details that are going to happen with the sample. Like a small number of establishments with missing zip codes have been assigned to the large zip code in each county for consistency across samples. Where does the sample come from? We're missing, or we drop anyone if they don't have county information, or if Alaska or Hawaii are excluded. So we made all this outside the RDC before even looking at the data. And then when I submitted the disclosure, this is literally the spreadsheet that I got when the disclosure came back. And you can see same tab names. And the key thing that I think has really helped us is like here around line 10, where my cursor is, you can see that online is no. And that's something that's mechanically generated. So online, this will change between online is no and online is yes, depending on whether I was including e-commerce establishments in my sample or not. And so that makes it easy for me to know, to make sure that I know which version of the data that I'm doing. And then also, I have the program listed that I created it with, and the exact timestamp of when I last ran this table. And so I think this has saved my butt a lot when I get a disclosure back, is having this metadata associated with the disclosure. And I haven't had any pushback from any of the RDC admins on anything like that. And so that was everything I had to say there. And I lost the Q&A panel for a second. When I changed how I was sharing. Okay, so it looks like I don't see any additional questions.
Great. Does anyone have anything else they'd like to ask Dominic before we sign off? We'll wait for just a couple seconds, see if anyone's out there typing. Dominic, do you have any last minute things that you wanted to elaborate more on, or are we good to go?
No, I think I'm good. Thanks everybody for coming, and thanks Bryce for organizing this and having me. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you everyone for signing on. Dominic, a big thanks to you. This was great. Feel free to reach out to Dominic if you have any additional questions or would like to see a copy of the paper. Let's see, our next FSRDC presentation.
Hey, Bryce, turns out there were 2 more questions that came in.
Oh, okay. Great.
Is there evidence on prices and quantities that can be done using the product trailer data? The Census of Retail Trade doesn't have quantities for anything except auto sales. And so unfortunately, there's nothing, and they don't have any prices for anything. And so there's nothing we can do there. Have I considered other concentration metrics, such as the 4-firm concentration ratio? Yes, we have that in an appendix, and the 4-firm concentration ratio looks exactly the same. It's been steadily increasing over this time period. Sorry for interrupting.
No, I appreciate it. Okay, well, thank you all so much. As I was saying, our next presentation will be in either late August or early September, and we have someone who will discuss a project using health data. So I will, of course, send out flyers and announcements and all that as we get closer to it. Thank you all so much for attending. Have a great afternoon.